Okay, so the adoption credit. This is a very generous credit. There are a couple of how this credit is applied and to what expenses kind of depends on the type of adoption as well. Certain types of adoptions have a more generous credit than other types of adoptions, but it's up to 100% of qualified adoption expenses, up to a maximum of $15,950 per eligible child that is adopted. So if you're married, you can't file separately and take the credit. You have to file jointly in order to take that credit. What are the qualified adoption expenses? So these are, again, reasonable and necessary expenses, adoption fees, court costs, attorney fees, similar expenses directly related to the legal adoption of an eligible child. So again, we've got eligible, qualified expenses and eligible child. Qualified expenses do not include any reimbursements under employer programs. Some employers will reimburse for adoption expenses. That is not included in there. An eligible child is one who is under age 18 or is incapable of caring for themselves, but does not include the child of an individual spouse. So you can't adopt your stepchildren, is what that is saying. That doesn't count. Oftentimes, taxpayers will pay expenses in a tax year other than the year in which the adoption becomes final. Sometimes it can take a very long time. You know, you start an adoption in 1 year and it doesn't get finalized until a year or two down the road. So if there are expenses paid in the years before an adoption becomes final, taxpayers will take the credit in the year immediately after it is paid. Those expenses are paid. So if you started the adoption procedures in 2023, but it finalized in 2024, you're going to take all of those 2023 expenses in 2024 toward the credit. That's when you're going to get the credit. So for expenses paid in the year the adoption is finalized or afterwards, taxpayers will take the credit in the year paid. So if you continue to have expenses come in 2025, you would then take those expenses in 2025. Total amount of qualified adoption expenses cannot exceed $15,950 per child. So here's an example. Mila and Layla legally adopted a child in 2023. They incurred and paid qualified adoption expenses of $6,000 in 2022, $4,000 in 2023, $7,000 in 2024. So there's $17,000 in total. Well, that's more than the credit that you get. So some of these adoption expenses are not going to be eligible for the credit. They would be entitled to an adoption credit of $10,000 in 2023 and an additional $5,950 in 2024 because that's up to the $15,950. So if a taxpayer adopts a child who is not a citizen, so foreign adoption has some special rules, the credit is allowed only in the year in which the adoption becomes final or in a later year if the expenses were paid or occurred in a later year. So if this were a foreign adoption and the adoption were finalized in 2024, they would not be able to take these expenses until 2024. It'd still be limited to the $15,950 though. Okay, whereas in this case, if it's a domestic adoption, they got to take a $10,000 credit in 2023. Okay, so the year that it becomes finalized. Special needs children as well have some special rules. So a special needs child would be determined by the state, right? So usually with special needs adoptions, there is, the state would determine that it's that particular type of adoption. In that case, for a special needs child, you don't have to have the expenses. You can, even if you don't have any expenses, and oftentimes with special needs child, the state takes care of all the expenses. Because there's there are more difficulties in adopting these children, but you get a $15,950 credit, even if you don't have the expenses that go along with it. Now, the child has to be a U.S. citizen or resident, and the credit is taken in the year that the adoption becomes final for those special needs children. I had a client who adopted 2 special needs children, and so they had a huge credit that they were allowed. So you take it on Form 8839. let's see, you do have to provide information about the child. Also any credit that was taken in a prior year that you apply against the current credit that's available. Also, there's a space on there to account for any employer provided adoption benefits. So if the employer provided any payment for that. Now, there are AGI limitations for this. Let's see. Modified AGI, again, is what is used. So any income earned abroad that was not subject to taxation or was eligible for that foreign earned income exclusion, you'd have to add that back in. The phase out starts at $239,230 for AGI up to $279,230. So again, this is you take the eligible expenses up to the amount of the total amount, the limit, the $15,950, multiply it by this fraction here. So this again, the 40,000 represents the phase out range between 279 and 239 there. So as an example here, $18,000 in qualified adoption expenses or modified AGI is 247. So in this case, we would take the 279,230 minus 247 minus the modified AGI divided by 40,000, multiply that total by the 15,590. Now, if they had $12,000 of adoption expenses, we'd have to multiply it by $12,000. So it's whatever is going to be less of those two, either 15,950 or the actual expenses that were incurred is what you're going to use. Here's the form that is used, again, if there's multiple children. So information about the children, and then the adoption, maximum adoption credit, and then the calculation of all of that. So if you filed this in a previous year for the same child, then you would probably be entering in here. It says to see instructions for the amount to enter. That would probably be the amount of the credit that was received prior. And then the AGI limitation as well. Again, if you get employer provided adoption benefits, you do have to subtract that amount. The credit is limited to the amount that was actually paid or incurred in excess of the assistance. Let's see. If assistance exceeds the actual expenses, the excess is considered to be taxable income. So if your employer gave you $15,000 and your expenses were $10,000, you have $5,000 of taxable income. Now, you do have to send in the documents, the adoption documents for substantiation. Okay. Questions?